We begin the day with U.S. President Trump's push for peace in Ukraine, a plan that clearly favors Russia. On Wednesday, Trump lashed out at Ukrainian President Zelensky for rejecting U.S. terms to end the war with Russia. But what did the U.S. president expect? The ceasefire would not only freeze territorial lines as is, it would also recognize Russian control over Crimea. And that is a red line for Kyiv and for its European allies. European leaders met with Ukrainian representatives in London today. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he pulled out of that meeting, reportedly catching everyone off guard. Trump's special envoy, Stephen Witkoff, he heads to Moscow for talks with Vladimir Putin this week. And on Wednesday, the Kremlin said it was pleased with these developments so far. Russia appears to be holding all of the cards, despite the fact that Washington and its allies seem further apart today than they were even 2 days ago. Key voices in Washington are signaling that now is the time to close the deal, and that whether Kyiv is ready or not. Here's Vice President JD Vance speaking earlier today during a visit to India.
We've engaged in an extraordinary amount of diplomacy, of on-the-ground work. We've really tried to understand things from the perspective of both the Ukrainians and the Russians. What do Ukrainians care the most about? What do the Russians care the most about? And I think that we've put together a very fair proposal. We're going to see if the Europeans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians are ultimately able to get this thing over the finish line. Again, I feel pretty optimistic about it. I think everybody has been negotiating in good faith, but it's now time, I think, to take if not the final step, one of the final steps, which is at a broad level, the parties saying, we're going to stop the killing, we're going to freeze the territorial lines at some level close to where they are today, and we're going to actually put in place the kind of long-term diplomatic settlement that hopefully will lead to long-term peace.
Now I want to bring in Tyson Barker. He's a foreign policy analyst who most recently served in the Biden-Harris administration working on Ukraine. Tyson, it's good to see you again. Washington, we've heard, is pushing a deal that includes recognizing Russia's control over Crimea. But if we go back to 2018, the Trump administration declared that, and we've got a quote here we want to pull up, in concert with allies, partners, and the international community, the United States rejects Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and pledges to maintain this policy until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. Now, those were words signed by, at the time, U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo for, at the time, President Trump. What has changed?
It's very clear if anything has changed. If anything, Russia has become only more egregious in its full-scale invasion of Ukraine since 2022. The Crimea Declaration, which you just read, is a pretty significant piece of diplomacy. It's a pretty significant statement, and it was modeled after a previous statement from 1940, the Wells Declaration, which said that the United States would never recognize the illegal occupation and annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, which the United States never did, in fact. And all State Department maps from 1940 to 1990, when the Baltic states became free again, all had the Balts as independent states. So that was a policy consistent across many administrations, and it's unclear what has changed in this current environment to make a change possible, other than the Trump administration is clearly interested in ingratiating itself to Russia in the interest of establishing some kind of peace agreement.
Well, I want to be clear here, based on the historical context that you just put this in, what we're seeing in the Trump 2.0 administration regarding Ukraine and Russia, it appears to be a complete betrayal of what we have known to be U.S. foreign policy for basically the last half century.
Right. It's a repudiation of international law, which has internationally recognized borders and says that they can be changed by force. It's a repudiation of statements by Congress. in multiple different iterations from declarations, statements, and just any kind of law passed on sanctions basis, including CATSA. And it's a repudiation of the first Trump administration, which drew on that broad bipartisan and broadly supported American consensus and international consensus to say that this couldn't happen. And of course, this would be validating bad behavior, saying, yes, in fact, you can change borders by force. And it would invite other countries to try to do so. And as long as they stay long enough and hit hard enough, perhaps have those actions ratified after the fact. So this would be a pretty significant departure from post-World War II history if it were to come to pass. But of course, Zelensky has already rejected this before the deal actually was presented, because this is not an area that the Ukrainian people will accept.
Well, we heard today from the U.S. Vice President that unless Washington's terms are accepted, the U.S. could simply walk away from the table. How credible do you think that threat is?
The short time span of this second Trump administration has left many times when the Trump administration said it was going to walk away from the table. Usually cooler heads do prevail. That has happened in the case of the early critical minerals agreement in mid-February. That happened, of course, a bit after the Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky at the end of February, and has happened in several episodes since. The hope is actually there's a lot of different voices in this administration pushing and advocating for a lot of different types of policies. And the hope is that whatever consensus is forged can be consistent with what Ukraine needs and, is consistent with its red lines, and also with those of the European partners, which are ultimately going to have to backstop whatever peace agreement is agreed to.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that. Do you think Washington can really broker a deal that sticks without the buy-in of its European allies?
As of last Thursday, when Secretary Rubio and Special Representative Witkoff met with European partners in France, it seemed like there was some convergent positions coming together. But since then, that clearly has not been the case. I think that the Europeans were left with a rude awakening that, again, the United States is going back to its preferred, or this government is going back to its preferred modality for negotiating this peace, which is bilaterally over the heads of Europe and perhaps over the head of Ukraine. Now, of course, it's never going to stick and be durable without the support of both. So nothing negotiated strictly with the Russians is going to lead to an actual peace. It's going to require the European buy-in, and it's going to require the Ukrainians to accept it as well.
European leaders, they've pushed back hard against what the U.S. is reportedly putting on the table. Do you see this as the start of a real transatlantic split over Ukraine? I mean, if it is, it would certainly be something that the Kremlin would like to see, wouldn't it?
I think that, bottles of vodka are popping in the Kremlin as we speak. This is definitely in the strategic interest of all of those in the Kremlin who do not have the U.S.'s or Europe's best interests at heart. And I think that both in European capitals and in Ukraine, the responsible scenario planning at this point is to calculate for all potential eventualities. That includes an abrupt and unilateral reversal of U.S. support of Ukraine and its removal of its intelligence support and removal of its weapons support, any kind of support that it might have. Because we saw a little bit of this following the Oval Office meeting when the U.S. withdrew weapons shipments and ISR support, which made defending the front line, and particularly Ukraine's position in Kursk in Russia, extremely difficult. So I think that it's not the beginning. We're in the midst of a very turbulent period in U.S.-European relations, and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better, much better soon.
Tyson Barker, as always, it's good to get your insights. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, our coverage continues now with Charles Kupchan. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University. Professor, it's good to have you back on the program. What do you make of the vice president's comments? How credible do you think the threat is?
Well, I think that Trump is getting frustrated, right? He said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. He's been trying since almost the beginning of the second term to bring the conflict to a conclusion, talking to Putin, sending his team to Saudi Arabia, now sending them to Europe, and there isn't much to show for it. So I think it's credible that the United States could, quote unquote, walk away. What exactly that means, nobody knows. Does it mean walk away from attempting to broker peace? Does it mean walk away from Ukraine and stop supporting Kyiv? Does it mean walk away from Russia and give up on the reset? We just don't know exactly what the Trump administration has in mind.
We do know that there is a meeting taking place right now in London aimed at finding a ceasefire. The U.S. Secretary of State is not attending that meeting. Trump's special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, he's in Russia this week, hoping to work out some kind of agreement there. If a deal is made, it looks more and more like it's going to be a Russian affair. Or do you see it differently?
I don't think we know. I mean, the most important provision of the deal that, as far as we know, is on the table is freeze in place. Stop the killing, separate Russian and Ukrainian forces, put into a demilitarized zone, buy time for longer conversations about a peace settlement. What we don't really have much information about is the status of other demands that Putin has been making, which in many respects are poison pills. And they include a Ukraine that is demilitarized, a Ukraine that can't raise its own forces, a Ukraine that doesn't get any more Western arms. Those are all deal breakers. And until we have some sense as to whether Russia is ready to accept a deal that leaves the 80% of Ukraine free, sovereign, independent, we just don't know whether this deal is something that is going to see the light of day.
Washington is reportedly pushing a deal that would include recognizing Russia's control over Crimea. Now, if we go back to the first Trump administration back in 2018, that Trump administration firmly defended Ukraine's territorial integrity, including its territory of Crimea. Has the U.S., in your opinion, lost credibility as a peace broker with this type of policy U-turn?
Well, listen, at some point you have to let pragmatism trump principle. And the principle is clear here, that Russia has engaged in an illegal attack against Ukraine. It is illegally occupying Ukrainian territory. On the other hand, it is not at all likely that Ukraine is going to be able to muster the military capability needed to defeat Russia, expel Russian forces from eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So in some respects, what we're seeing here is a deal that says, listen, folks, the best that we can do here is end the fighting and make sure that the part of Ukraine that is still free is an independent sovereign country. I would not support the recognition of Russian control of Crimea, of Russian annexation of eastern Ukraine, because in many respects that confirms the principle that countries can take the territory of other countries by force and get away with it. But I do think a freeze in place, giving up on the idea for now of restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity, does make sense.
A freeze in place that would be one way to go, but what about changing the narrative? The Trump White House, it seems, wants to put the blame on Ukraine for this war, which is also a complete change from what we have been hearing from the United States. Does that, in your opinion, increase or lessen the chances of both sides actually reaching a credible ceasefire?
I think that Trump is doing the right thing by reaching out to Putin and trying to end the war. But the way that he has been going about it makes no sense to me. They haven't really had a coherent strategy. If you want to end this war, you need to put Ukraine in as strong a position as possible at the negotiating table to convince Putin that he can't take any more land by force. The idea of blaming Ukraine for the war, of cutting off the flow of military aid and intelligence, of somehow saying we're going to walk away from Ukraine, that's an invitation to Putin to keep coming. So I think what we need to see here is a U.S. policy that gets behind supporting Ukraine for the foreseeable future, making sure that the 80% of Ukraine that is still under the control of Kyiv is a going concern. That, to me, is the essence of an acceptable deal.
Professor Charles Kupchan, as always, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights. Professor, thank you.
Good to be with you.
We can bring in Torrey Taussig. She's director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Thanks for joining us. So the U.S. is asking Ukraine to accept. The U.S. is asking Ukraine to accept Russian control of Crimea. But Zelensky has already said that he won't even discuss that because that would violate the Ukrainian constitution. So is there even a way forward here if that's the case?
For the peace plan that the United States has offered, I do not see a way forward. Zelensky has said, as you mentioned, that Ukraine will not allow for de jure Russian recognition of occupation of Crimea. And there are other parts of this proposal that Ukraine would not accept. For example, a hold on Ukraine's future membership in NATO. The quick ability of Russia to reinvade Ukraine post-ceasefire. This is not a proposal that is going to provide Ukraine with a sustainable and just peace.
Trump did say that if Ukraine does not accept that, if they don't accept the peace, then they could continue to fight for 3 years. He said, I think that's an abstract number that he was using there, and then he said that the consequence would be that Ukraine would lose all of its territory to Russia. Isn't that true, though, if the U.S. stops supporting Ukraine, that is the scenario that they would be facing?
I think this is one of Kyiv's greatest concerns. What we've heard from Vice President Vance, what we've heard from Secretary of State Rubio, is that the United States is willing to walk away from ceasefire negotiations if Ukraine and Russia do not agree to the negotiation peace proposal put on the table. This would, in all intensive purposes, be to the detriment of Ukraine. This is a peace proposal, as I mentioned, that heavily favors Russia. If the United States chooses to walk away with this deal not accepted, it will likely lead to a stop of future military assistance from the U.S. to Ukraine and the over time removal of U.S. sanctions on Russia. So the two options facing Kyiv are either the acceptance of an unjust, unsustainable peace proposal or the loss of United States as a key backer. And I would say today things are not looking great for Kyiv in either of those options being presented by Washington.
The Trump administration has said that they, in that peace proposal, they were offering Ukraine security guarantees. Could you talk more about that?
So the only security assurances on the table right now are from the Europeans themselves. UK and France have been leading efforts for a European reassurance force in Ukraine that would help Ukraine maintain the peace following a ceasefire, should one occur, and also help rebuild Ukraine's defenses and inhibit Russia from reinvading. The United States has not shown any commitment to that sort of idea, not only in a lack of troops, but also in enablers. And so the only assurances we have right now, and I wouldn't even call them assurances, are what we're hearing from the Europeans. But again, in either the peace proposal scenario or in the United States walking away from negotiations, this is not an administration that is committed to security guarantees in the form of U.S. capabilities or U.S. troops.
And the Europeans who are expected to offer those guarantees are actually pushing back against Trump's peace proposal. Are Europeans making any plans for the possibility that the U.S. could walk away from negotiations here?
I would very much expect that Europeans are planning for the worst case scenario in which the United States backs away. I think we've seen that in the talks of a reassurance force that I mentioned, but I think what we heard from Defense Minister Healy in the UK and others today is that Europe will stand with Ukraine essentially for as long as it takes in fighting and after a peace, whenever that may come. And so we are hearing fundamentally different lines coming from the Europeans and the United States in how far both sides of the Atlantic are willing to support Ukraine in the future.
Okay, Torrey Taussig from the Atlantic Council. Thank you.
Thank you.